So powerlifters need to train hard.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock.
Surely, the harder you train, the better the gains will be all the time, right?
Right? Wrong.
Not necessarily. Most people don't really fully understand how hard you should be training and what you need to understand about how training difficulty changes through time. So in this video, I'll be breaking down everything that you need to understand about training difficulty and how you can manipulate that depending on various factors. And as a bonus, I will be debunking myths and misconceptions that you may not realize that you have. And holding these myths and misconceptions could actually be catastrophic for your training. So let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right in. If you're new here, welcome to the Strong Ambitions channel, the place for all powerlifting athletes and coaches. My name is Cheung and I've been coaching powerlifting for over a decade. And I've coached several individuals as well as university teams to the international stage. So how hard should powerlifters be training? Now, in order to understand how hard powerlifters should train, we should probably define what we actually mean. Training difficulty is a bit of an ambiguous term, so we're going to include some terms that are slightly more scientific. So in this case, let's use the word training dose. The reason why we use the word dose is because it helps us understand that when there is a dose of training, there is subsequently a response to training. And the connection between the dose and the response is the dose-response relationship. Now, in the body of research, we can appreciate the fact that there seems to be a dose-response curve that looks like this. And this tells us that there is an optimal range for training doses. This also tells us that there is such a thing as too much as well, where there are diminishing returns that are detrimental to the training response. So to understand training dose properly, we also need to understand two very important concepts that are core to training science. The first one is going to be the fitness fatigue model, and the second one is going to be the SFRA curve. So the fitness fatigue model is a popular theory in sports science that explains an athlete's performance readiness based on two opposing after effects of training. Those are fitness and fatigue. Now, fitness and fatigue exist as biological processes that are happening within our bodies simultaneously. And the superposition or combined effects of these forces give rise to what we could practically perform in real life. And we call this performance. The fitness fatigue model provides us a simplified way to understand training adaptations. It helps athletes and coaches make informed decisions on training loads, intensity, as well as recovery periods. And when we visualize the fitness fatigue model on a graph, we get this theoretical performance curve. The performance curve is also the same as the SFRA curve, or stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation curve. And in this curve, we have these four moments after a dose of training. They are the stimulus, and this represents the training load or stress placed on the athlete. Fatigue, after a training session, an athlete experiences immediate fatigue, and this is a short-term decline in performance capability. Recovery, given adequate rest and nutrients, the body starts to recover from this fatigue. Adaptation, if the stimulus is appropriate and recovery is sufficient, the body will adapt and make the athlete stronger or more efficient than before. We will use these curves later on to describe some ideas, so let's take a mental picture of it. So within this thing that we refer to as the training dose, we have constituent variables, namely volume, intensity of load, i.e. percentage of 1 rep max, intensity of effort, proximity to failure, exercise selection, and a number of exercises. So increase in any of these individually while keeping everything else consistent will obviously lead to an increase in the training stimulus or dose. So how hard should you be training as a beginner versus an experienced lifter? So let's take the case of a beginner lifter. So from a physical point of view, this will depend on their training background with other activities. So they generally have lower work capacity if they do not have much of a training background, but they will have more work capacity if they have done other sports or physical activities before. And if they are completely untrained, they're going to be generally poorer in terms of coordination as well. So they are also likely to really feel the shock of DOMS or muscle soreness from exposure to lifting as well. So from a psychological point of view, they haven't really built up important expectations or habits, and you really want them to build up momentum mentally with looking forward to the training process. So the nature of the training is going to be centered around building good technique and habits. So this means that with the core lifts, their training difficulty may be low to medium in nature and with a slightly higher distant proximity to failure so that they can pay more attention to technique. So their perception may be that training is going to be hard because they're new to the idea of lifting heavy weights. So early on in their training, their RPE is likely going to be very low with lower volume and lower percentages too. However, they they may benefit from slightly harder training when it comes to their accessories or bodybuilding work. Their volume should still be relatively low to begin with, but with graded exposure to moderate high RPEs through time. So now let's talk about experienced lifters. So how hard should you train, short versus long term? So when it comes to long-term training, we are going to be talking about how hard we train over training blocks, mesocycles or months, as well as macrocycles and across the years. Now, when it comes to looking at training across seasons or years, we need to look at the context of the athlete and where powerlifting is with respect to their value system, goals and life. So one of the things that I often look at is whether the athlete is someone who wants to be involved with powerlifting for as long as possible. Now, if they are, I often look to my personal coaching philosophy with coaching long-term athletes and adopt the idea of competitive longevity. Now, in an ideal world, if human psychology was not relevant, we would be training as hard as we can and try to find the maximal adaptive volume or dose. In simple terms, this is the optimal dose of training. But most powerlifters are not full-time powerlifters, and it is important to look at what is going on with the rest of their life. If they are not in a position to be highly motivated to push training hard because of life events or whatnot, pushing a program hard continuously can make training feel like a chore. If this happens long enough, they will feel a sense of loss of agency and autonomy. And consequently, this is how people burn out from powerlifting or from other sports, and they fall off the bandwagon. And at the end of the day, this may lead to individuals changing their long-term goals and not want to pursue powerlifting anymore. So it's important to take this into consideration of avoiding sport burnout. So when it comes to looking at training programming across blocks, mesocycles or months, along with looking at the context of the lifter's life, you should also look at the context of the competition calendar. Now, when it comes to peaking and prepping for competitions, it can be very draining. So you want to consider how often they normally compete, look at how frequently they have recently competed, and consider whether they are training towards a competition that is coming soon. Remember, if you do want to pull back from training stress, consider training at less than the maximal adaptive dose or less than the optimal dose, and potentially spend some time around the maintenance dose or minimum effective dose. So let's zoom in on a closer time frame and look at training dose across the span of an exercise, a session and a week. So when it comes to short-term training, we are going to be talking about how hard we train per exercise, per session, as well as per week as well. Now, when it comes to a training dose in a week, this depends on where this week is in the context of your block length. Now, this will depend on whether you have a slightly more reactive and iterative bottom-up approach to programming, or whether you have a more top-down traditional block periodization approach to training, where you have a predetermined block duration. Either way, if you are at the start of a block, where you are performing what most coaches refer to as introduction weeks, you want to start off with a lower dose around a maintenance or minimum effective dose level, i.e. start a little bit more conservatively. There are 3 reasons why you want to do this. The first reason is if you are starting a new block or phase of training, you are going to start relatively under-conditioned for harder training. So your work capacity is likely going to be on a lower side. Secondly, it's better to start too low than to start too high, where you may find yourself training at a level that you cannot keep up with. As a coach, you don't know where the maximal adaptive dose is, so you want to titrate the dose upwards in a gradual and safe manner and see how the lifter responds to the dose over time. It's useful to remember not to have massive spikes in training from week to week. And as a rule of thumb, avoid progressing one week to another by more than 10%. So if you are making progressions week after week, you are essentially dialing up the dose, and you can tell when you have reached the point past its maximal recoverable dose. When this happens, the outcome is that you will get continuously falling performance as a pattern of behavior. Thirdly, starting too hard may risk spikes in training volume and training load, and that can be a risk factor for injury as well. And when it comes to training, nothing slows down long-term progress like getting a bad injury that could have been avoided through training more sensibly. So if you do find yourself needing to deload, you may want to consider dropping the dose towards the level of maintenance or around the lower end of minimum effective dose. This may be similar to the level of difficulty as introductory weeks. So this can be higher or lower depending on the athlete, whether they are someone who detrains very easily or if they are someone who needs harsh deloads. Now, when it comes to individual sessions and exercises, you need to consider what your goals and priorities are for this phase of training. So you also want to consider the SAID principle, which is, if you do not know, is the specific adaptations on imposed demand. So consider what the adaptations that you want to be driving at this phase of training. So there is nothing inherently wrong with spreading the dose evenly across all exercises, but generally speaking, most coaches will want to prioritize a variation or a set of exercises over another. And this is simply because there is a likelihood that one of them will be more effective at contributing to the gains than the other. For example, let's say you have competition squats and pause squats in your training. Now, if you are someone who needs work on a bottom position, having a higher dose on the pause squats may be more beneficial for that lifter at that point in time than pushing more of the competition squats. And as the state of the lifter changes, so does the training as well. You also want to consider how the prescription of one exercise affects the other ones around it as well. This will definitely require you to consider how you structure your training week or microcycle, but I will talk about that another time. Now, as promised, I will break down some really common myths and misconceptions with training difficulty. So let's start with the first one. Sets need to be done at a high RPE. So the first one on the list is the belief that your sets need to be done at a high rate of perceived exertion, or RPE. While to a certain extent, it's true that pushing yourself to train at high RPEs can be beneficial for muscle growth and strength. And this is through activating more important motor units with certain muscle fibers. Ultimately, it's not necessary for every set or even every session to be at high RPEs. Consistently training at high RPEs can lead to quicker fatigue and potentially reducing how much volume that you can do. Instead, a balanced approach that includes varying intensities and RPEs can ensure long-term progress whilst keeping you safe. Oh, if you do want to check out whether low RPE work is pointless, go check out this video that I made here. So the next myth is high intensity training is hard training. Now, with this second myth, intensity in this context refers to the percentage of your 1 rep max. While training at high intensities can be challenging, it doesn't necessarily represent the overall hardness of a training session, particularly if the RPE and volume is managed. Factors like volume, rest periods, exercise selection, and even your psychological and physiological state play significant roles in determining the actual difficulty of a workout. So remember, while intensity is a crucial variable, it isn't the sole determinant of the training difficulty of that session. So the third myth is that you don't need to train your accessory exercises hard. While the main lifts like the squat, bench, and deadlift are central to powerlifting, accessory movements are essential to addressing weak points, build muscle, and maintain work capacity. Now, downplaying their importance or not giving them the best effort can limit your progress in the primary lifts. While you don't necessarily need to max out every accessory lift, approaching them with intention, purpose, and dedication is vital for optimal development. So the fourth myth is that your primary day needs to be your hardest day. It may seem logical to give everything that you've got on your primary day, but this mindset can limit the creative ways of designing microcycles. So you may have a secondary day that is actually harder than your primary day. And the purpose of the secondary day is to create a stimulus that helps you show up in performance on your primary day, where your primary day is of a higher absolute intensity, i.e. percentage of a 1 rep max. So the fifth misconception is optimal training is hard training. So there seems to be this belief that optimal training days always means subjectively hard training. While pushing your limits can lead to significant gains, always going all out isn't necessarily optimal. Consistent progress in powerlifting requires finding an optimal dose of training that elicits the greatest rate of gains in adaptations. And we do not actually know what that may be for individual athletes, but sometimes it may actually be very manageable and easy training. At the end of the day, any coach can push an athlete hard and make them tired. But if it doesn't lead to greater progress, then you're just exercising and doing a lot of junk work. By understanding and respecting the importance of each phase, you ensure sustainable progress without burning out or injuring yourself. So to understand training difficulty, you may find it useful to understand training volume as well. So check out this video where I talk about everything that you need to know to understand training volume. If you found this video useful, please click like, subscribe, and send it to someone that you think would be interested to know about this. If you've got any other ideas for future videos, please comment on the box below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on the next one.